All right, people. So we are live now on X and YouTube, and the premise for this gathering is that I put out a general invitation for anybody who would like to have a debate on the RFK endorsement issue because it obviously generates a lot of excitable feelings on social media, especially if you don't just revert to the standard posture of cheerleading and drooling and being a brown noser for these particular politicians. So I understand why people don't take too kindly to that. And so what I figured what I would do is something I've done a number of times in the past was just which is just send out a general invitation for anybody who would like to have a debate, or more aptly probably you would call it a discussion, because we're not doing any kind of formal structure here. Um, but if anybody out there in the comments would like to join, um, let me know. DM me on X, where I have open messages, and I will send you the link, provided that you're able to demonstrate a basic competence to engage in rational thought and discussion, which I know for many of you out there can be a bit of a struggle. So we have two guys here who don't have their cameras on, because I guess they're largely anonymous, which is perfectly fine. I guess I'm just going to spell out the basics of my argument or point, and anybody who would like to respond can then go ahead and make whatever points you'd like.
Go for
Okay,
it.
so number one, obviously, I understand the political logic as to why Trump would want to bring Robert F. Kennedy Jr. into his campaign fold. I'm not disputing that. If I were just a ruthless advisor to Trump who was just trying to tell him the best campaign strategies to maximize his odds for victory, I probably would have advised him to do what he's done, which is embrace RFK, rattle off all kinds of platitudes about how wonderful RFK is and how storied his family is and all this other kind of stuff, because the polling data had suggested for a number of months that it could be the case that RFK might have drawn more voters from Trump than he did from the Democrat, whether it be Biden previously or now Kamala Harris. The polling data wasn't entirely straightforward on that score. Sometimes it was a bit mixed. And either way, it wasn't overwhelmingly obvious one way or another who RFK might advantage or disadvantage. But there was some polling data suggesting that it could disproportionately disadvantage Trump. And in a very close election, which comes down to a handful of states, and the margins are tiny, that could make an impact. So I'm not disputing the political logic of Trump doing this, but what I am observing is that, lost in this ridiculous euphoria which overtook X in particular, some parts of YouTube, and elsewhere on the internet, was that RFK Jr. just repudiated the entire premise of the campaign that he had been at least ostensibly running since October of last year. So let's recall, in October of last year, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. decided that he was going to exit the Democratic primaries that he had been, again, ostensibly running in for the prior, 7-8 months, and become an independent candidate, a third-party candidate, with the idea being that he was uniquely positioned to challenge the two-party system. He was going to take on both Trump and Biden. Obviously, in the Democratic primaries, he got a lot of right-wing and alternative media hype because he was aiming his ire primarily at the Democrats, which I guess you might argue is expected if he's running in the Democratic Party primary. But when you're running as an independent candidate, as a third-party candidate, then obviously you're running against both major party candidates. And so he went around soliciting contributions and donations and support on that basis. At one point, he was actually polling better than any third-party candidate since Ross Perot in 1992, which, number one, suggested that there is a genuine appetite in the populace for an alternative to the two-party system. And number two, suggested that he might at least preliminarily have some unique benefits, whether it's because in terms of galvanizing mass support, at least in a way that was significant enough to be modestly formidable. Whether it be his family lineage, obviously everybody's familiar with the Kennedy dynasty. I definitely take exception to how that Kennedy dynasty gets mythologized and put into this weird folklore that just is used to like embellish the Kennedy record and mystify or mysticize aspects of what John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy Sr. did, and then the subsequent, progeny of that familial dynasty, whatever they're pursuing. But either way, it clearly does still have some. It's always his family dynasty and the assassinations of his father and uncle. I don't know when it became the case that having your father and uncle assassinated was like a big attribute to become president. Like, when did that become a credential for becoming president? But, again, we'll leave that aside. In terms of the Trump endorsement, you don't have to do very much strenuous research to go a month ago, to look at a month ago or 2 months ago, to look at some very, very vehement critiques that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was then making of Trump. And I posted one particularly illustrative example of this yesterday. And so I'm just going to quote some choice excerpts. And this gets to, I guess, my fundamental observation about the nature of this endorsement, which is that it reeks of duplicity. It reeks of scamming. It reeks of kind of a shambolic nature of his candidacy, because he's not even attempting to reconcile the searing critiques of Trump that he made a month or two ago, and that he's now apparently abandoning and then now joining forces with Trump in some form or fashion. Obviously, we don't know what form that's exactly going to take, but he did endorse Trump. He appeared at a campaign rally with Trump in Arizona, and he's reported to be doing some other kinds of campaigning initiatives with Trump. So let me just read you a quick excerpt. I promise I won't drone on forever, and everybody else is going to get a chance to respond. But here is this tweet, if I can find it. Okay, here it is. This is what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said on May 26th. So not that long ago, earlier this summer. Okay. President Trump, quote, President Trump scammed American workers. He promised to bring back manufacturing, raise wages, fix trade deals, close the carried interest loophole, and help small farmers. But everything President Trump achieved were things the Republican machine wanted. Now, ironically, this is my comment. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is subsuming himself into the Republican machine by joining forces with the Republican presidential nominee. That seems pretty straightforward to me. He said he let... RFK says President Trump let the Bush wing of the GOP run all his agencies. His interior secretary was an oil and gas lobbyist. His defense secretary was a Raytheon lobbyist. EPA administrator was a coal lobbyist. All true, et cetera, et cetera. His labor secretary was a lawyer for mega corporations. RFK continues, we had the worst rioting and looting in this country had seen since the 60s under President Trump. He inflamed racial tensions and didn't keep us safe. Instead of using federal law enforcement to stop the rioting, Trump thought it was good optics to let Democrat cities burn. Now, here's the foreign policy section, which is of the most interest to me. RFK Jr. says, quote, President Trump bragged about arming Ukraine more than Obama did. He also walked away unilaterally from the intermediate range nuclear missile treaty with Russia, destabilizing our relationship. He also exacerbated tensions between Ukraine and Russia that ultimately caused a war. So here's my comment. Amazingly, RFK Jr. is accusing Trump not just of having a hardline bellicose policy toward Ukraine and Russia during his administration, which he provably did. He's also accusing Trump of bearing responsibility or being culpable for the Ukraine war that was subsequently launched in 2022. And meanwhile, RFK Jr. in one of his comments in announcing this endorsement says that the Ukraine issue is now what compels him to support Trump on the basis of what? I mean, spell that out. I'll be done in 2 seconds.
Sure.
And so Trump, he says Trump appointed the worst neocons to the highest positions of power in his administration: John Bolton, H.R. McMaster, and Robert O'Brien. Now, Lindsey Graham is one of his top advisors and likely to be his Secretary of State. So that's RFK Jr. saying Trump had all the worst quote-unquote neocons in his first administration, and there's every indication, according to RFK, that he's going to be doing the exact same thing in his second administration. Meanwhile, RFK Jr. got on the stage yesterday or Friday and said, Trump and I want to work together to expel the neocons, or Trump and I agree that the neocons ought to be expelled. Based on what? Who is he expelling? Name some names. RFK Jr. named names in this initial tweet or post, and on and on and on. So I could get into more specifics. RFK Jr. also accused Trump of colluding with Biden and corporate media to exclude him, RFK Jr., from the debates. So if you want to just make it, it was just this scheming and ill treatment by the DNC, which forced RFK Jr.'s hand. RFK Jr. himself and his campaign were saying that Trump was in on the effort to exclude him. And now I guess nobody just feels the need for that to be reconciled. So just in conclusion, final sentence or two, my point here is that this endorsement, despite the exhilaration and the euphoria that's produced among some quarters of the internet, it's one of the most transparent scams and ruses that I've really ever seen in U.S. politics. RFK Jr. claimed that he was running for the past almost 10 months or so to forge this 51 state and territory campaign to get on every ballot, to be a viable national force, and that he was uniquely positioned to do so. And he decided to just repudiate that and become a partisan Republican, which is what he's now doing. If he's standing around and championing Trump, he even put out this ridiculous assortment of cliches earlier today about the true meaning of the MAGA movement, which is about democracy and all this other stuff. It's just pablum and claptrap. I'm amazed that people are actually impressed by this garbage. There's nothing new about people being irrationally impressed by the Kennedy family dynasty. RFK Jr. obviously has leveraged that for his own purposes. He would be a total non-entity if he didn't have the last name that he did and his parents weren't who they are or were. But I find it insulting to your intelligence unless you're a Republican partisan. You just want your favorite politician, Donald Trump, back in power, and therefore you're willing to accept any garbage if it's in furtherance of that goal. That I understand. Others who try to make this kind of principled case for why this was so wonderful and selfless, I think are just fairly delusional. Because for evidence of that, all we need to do is just go check what RFK Jr. was at least claiming that he was running for not very long ago. So that's my basic standard that I usually apply when assessing any political figure, even if he comes from one of these vaunted, overrated, and I think criminally misportrayed family dynasties, and even if it can work to the short-term advantage of Donald Trump, who I'm not a cheerleader for. So maybe that's what sets me apart from a lot of people who are expressing their overwhelming joy and jubilation. So whoever would like to go.
Well,
next,
I think you're exactly correct on pretty much everything, except, you said it insults your intelligence, and that's true, but you have to, I think my position is most of America is extremely stupid and does not care about such things. It's expected that it will be a grift. It is. They are cheating. They are conning people. And I think if you don't expect that by now, it's just being naive. That's sort of my point. Of course it was. It's all of it forever has been that. Trump is grifting. Kamala is grift. It's all a grift, and they will say whatever they want at any moment. There's no consistency, nor will anyone hold them to account for anything. And I think we're just past the point where you should be upset about that. And just,
I'm not upset. I'm not upset about it. Well, I'm just describing what happened, and I'm countering some of this phony euphoria.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you, except that the only thing
it's not about my personal emotional state. I know people like to
no. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, but I think your standards for public behavior and public conduct are going to be constantly disappointed going forward.
They always are. So this is
right.
nothing new. But this is being portrayed as something new, something distinct, something that's worth valorizing. If it's just another example of standard fare, cynical political maneuvering, and people were just upfront and acknowledging that, okay, but that's not the main thrust of how people are reacting to this.
Yeah, but they're lying.
Like
I think they're all lying. I don't think any of them are. There are some brainwashed. There are some like Republican diehards or whatever that are sincere in that, but their words are meaningless. They're just going to say whatever the party tells them to say. I think most people are just genuinely lying to you when they say it. They know that it doesn't make sense, and they just are saying that.
And I mean, there's been a bunch of people on the right, or at least we'll say like a MAGA crowd, and it's really not a value thing for them. Like, oh yeah, we're going to get Kennedy. This is going to bring votes, whatever. Cool. Don't care what his position is. There's actually quite a bit of people, let's say in the broader conservative or Republican wing that are like, this is not good. Just as what I see kind of going on with the Democrat ticket, as I see a lot of never Trumpers were neocons, and they've made their way over into the Democrat Party. And we're talking about growing this big tent party, but really what it's done is it's actually pushed, let's say, the pro-Palestinian, pure anti-war people out of the party, right? So the tents haven't grown on either side. They've really just kind of shifted, right? But when we get back to the Kennedy portion, I think that, I'm not as, I guess, maybe cynical as both of you on this. I think that Kennedy earnestly thought that that was his path at that point in time, because, he did actually start out in the Democrat primary, right? Like, let's not forget that he started out and he tried in the Democrat primary because it was the party of his father and his uncle. And then basically he got blocked from doing that. And so then he took another path, which was this independent route.
Can I stop there? When you say he got blocked from doing that, what do you mean specifically?
Well, the Democrat Party was not going to run any primaries. They weren't going to have this kind of open primary system. And I get, the incumbent thing and everything like that, but they were suing him to get off ballots. He wasn't getting any airtime. They just were not going to have primaries.
But there was nothing that technically officially blocked him from running in the Democratic primaries. He was on ballots. He withdrew. Like, he would have been on the New Hampshire primary ballot. He might have gotten actually a decent number of votes, given that it's an open primary in New Hampshire, and independents and Republicans theoretically could have been able to vote for him in the New Hampshire primary. Joe Biden wasn't even on the ballot. He chose not to run. Yes, the Democratic Party, the DNC, the Biden operation did manipulate the primary process to slant it in his favor. But what would you expect an incumbent president to do? Like, but my point is, if you want to run an insurgent campaign against an incumbent president, you go into that recognizing that there's going to be institutional impediments that favor to you that then favor the president. So RFK could have kept running. He chose instead to run to withdraw from the Democratic primaries. Remember, this was a while ago now. This is last October.
Right.
He decided to do this a month ago.
Right.
Said, we have to get the infrastructure in place, have a 50-state strategy. So let's just focus on the 50-state strategy that he was supposedly working towards and soliciting donations for and grassroots support for the past 10 months. What happened to that? Because now that's all getting just funneled into the Republican Party. I don't think that's what he was making plain that he would actually anticipate doing. And that's one of the reasons why I call this a ruse.
But I'm not saying that. I don't think that was his intention the entire time to meld into the Republican Party again. So you have the strategy.
But whatever his intention was, that's what he's done.
Right? Yeah, that's fine. But to get to the point, like you have a strategy, right? And then you reassess it after, let's say, 6-9 months, and say, hey, look, my strategy is not working. It is not going to get me anything. So then he has to make a pragmatic decision. It's like, do I want to enter into this power sharing agreement, or do I want to go, get nothing, right? It's kind of like that, in the DMs when you ask like what my basic premise was, it's like the prisoner's dilemma, right? If I cooperate, I'll get something, but if I don't cooperate, I could get nothing, or I could be the one that's shut out. So, he's not going to get to be president no matter what, right? He's taking a risk with Trump. He has to enter into this power sharing agreement to get at least a little bit of something that might be his legacy. It seems to me that he earnestly cares about the health of people, right? He's been this environmental lawyer and all these things for many years. And so if he says, hey, if that's the only thing that I can kind of bite off on and consolidate, then I'm going to do it. So I really don't think that he intended from the start to go to this Republican Party. I agree with you. I mean, that's what happened, right? Obviously, I'm not going to try and say like the facts that aren't there, but I think that he was kind of pushed into a corner. And so he's making choices that are pragmatic at the time he has to make them, where he is right now. I mean, he just sees no path. I think he's fallen below 5% in polling right on now. So it's like he won't even get federal funding to start a third party. I don't even really think he honestly really wants to do this third party thing, because if Kamala wins, it's probably going to be 8 years of her. He'll be 78 or 79 then. So in all honesty, this is probably his best chance to get any little bit of power he can. And you may call it a grift, but I mean, everyone that's a politician is a grifter too.
Well, I use the word grift, and I'm not speaking to his intention. I'm not his psychologist. I can't get inside his brain. I just know that what he was claiming to do for the past 10 months, to some degree then even prior to that in the Democratic primary campaign that he was nominally running, and it's not at all remotely consistent with what he has now done in terms of his public presentation. People could say, oh, it was the pragmatic choice, or he, quote, changed his mind. If he changed his mind where he was denouncing and rejecting Trump a month or two ago in vehement terms based on what RFK Jr. said was their fundamental incompatibility on the most core issues of philosophy and governance, then let him explain that in further detail. He just come up with a bunch of platitudes and cliches.
So it would be better. Or is your complaint how people are just accepting it without any him explaining his 180 with any?
That's one of my complaints. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
let me just read. Here's a quote. Here's what RFK Jr. tweeted this morning. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like a little essay, like a little almost poetic essay that he sat down and composed like he's JFK sitting at the Resolute desk or something. What MAGA really means. The phrase has troubled liberals who think it's a call for a return to America before civil rights, gay rights, and women's rights. But I have a more generous interpretation, one that is truer to my experience than Donald Trump as he is today. Make America Great Again recalls a nation brimming with vitality, with a can-do spirit, with hope and a belief in itself. It was an America that was beginning to confront its darker shadows, could acknowledge the injustice in its past and present, yet at the same time could celebrate its successes. It was a nation of broad prosperity, the world's most vibrant middle class, and an idealistic belief, though not consistently applied, in freedom, justice, and democracy. It was a nation that led the world in innovation, productivity, and technology. And it was the healthiest country in the world. I have talked to many Trump supporters. I have talked with his inner circle. I've talked to the man himself. This is the America they want to restore. I've never heard a more ridiculous assortment of cliches and platitudes. That's just a bunch of absurd peplum. So where's the explanation for why he was repudiating Trump? Repudiating Trump a month ago versus that. I mean, how? Maybe I'm so unusual in my psyche that I can't help but look at that and find it to be just brazenly cynical and in the most ridiculously transparent way, and nobody else can relate to that reaction. But I don't think I'm that crazy. No, I just think people are in partisan cheerleading mode where anything that can advantage Trump is what they're going to cheer for, regardless of how little sense it makes.
Well, yeah, no, I feel exactly your frustration, or I used to, but then at some point, probably in the last 10 years, I learned to just sort of enjoy it and expect that that's how everyone is going to behave in politics. And I think that makes it, you come away with it a lot. It is a lot more satisfying to watch if you just accept that that's how everyone's going to behave. They're going to say things. It doesn't matter. None of it matters. We're the party of democracy. We're not going to have a vote. I'm against Trump for his thing, but now I love it. It's all, none of it means anything. It's just that. And that's, I know that's challenging for a lot of people that are like, honest, but that's not what that's not how America operates.
All right. Well, I
felt a lot better making
sort of like
that.
Yeah, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, like, as I was thinking about this, I think people are able to coalesce for discrete purposes and time, well, first, before I get into that, like what I'll say is we've seen actually throughout the years here, where people haven't exercised what little bit of political power that they've been able to wield, and it's been disastrous, right? Like if you talk to Jimmy Dore, like he'll always talk the force the vote thing, right? And what the squad didn't do. Now you're seeing squad members get voted out. I mean, what has the squad really accomplished in Congress? When they really had an opportunity to do something, they didn't. They got in line and they fell in line and nothing happened. You can talk about what Matt Gaetz did to kick out Speaker McCarthy. You know, you could say it's been disastrous, but they wielded what little bit of power they had at the time they had it. There is no promise that Kennedy is going to have any semblance of power or, you know, political sway 4 years from now, or it seems to be, in his opinion, you know, if a Kamala presidency is to happen. So people are able to coalesce for discrete purposes, right? As I was, you know, looking into this, I was reading more about something it reminded me of, right? During World War II, Mao was able to partner with the KMT. They were in the middle of a huge civil war, and they partnered with each other to fight the Japanese. And then, of course, they went on and fought their civil war after that, where Mao won, because they just saw that threat as existential first. And that's something that they want to do. So I very much see that as what, like, the Kennedy-Trump alliance is here. It's an alliance of convenience that I think the Democrat Party pushed Kennedy towards. I feel like if they had not been as heavy-handed in trying to sue to get him off the ballot, I don't think we would have been here. I think they overplayed it a little bit. But this, to me, is like realpolitik kind of pragmatism. I'm not going to speak to the, you know, the values of conservatism in the Republican Party and what Kennedy will bring. All that stuff you're talking about is right. You know, like, it's just word salad that he's going to throw out there in those tweets. He's going to kind of, you know, take the message and run with it, maybe color it himself a little bit. But he's kind of got to do it. I mean, if you were his campaign manager, what would you recommend?
Yeah, no one's gonna.
I don't know. I'm not his campaign manager.
Honesty.
I didn't sign up to be his campaign manager. But when you say the Democrats forced his hand, the Democrats did not force him to endorse Donald Trump and become a cheerleader for the Republican Party. That's something that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. decided to do on his own volition, whether it's for his own self-aggrandizement, whether it's for this fleeting, remote, ill-defined prospect that it could enable him to get some degree of political power. When you call it a power-sharing arrangement, I don't know that there's been any specificity. Maybe I missed it as to what he would actually do in a second Trump administration. I got the impression that it could be some just, obscure FDA panel that he might be on, which, you know, you can do some stuff with, I suppose, but it wouldn't really come to the core of many of the issues that he's been campaigning on around foreign policy, around so-called free speech. I mean, and also Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's misleading people about the nature of Trump and the Republican Party at this point, that they're these big defenders of free speech. Really? I'm not defending the Democrats. The Democrats have been horrendous on free speech from a variety of angles for years now, and I've covered it extensively. So I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that the critique of the Democrats does not therefore logically lead, or need not logically lead, to an endorsement of the Republicans as this salve. And that's what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is trying to claim, that Trump and the Republicans are going to uphold free speech. Really? Has anybody been alive for the past 10 months?
Well, let me.
Oh, yeah.
They've been trying to censor and stifle and punish all speech critical of Israel virtually on the grounds of anti-Semitism. Trump himself signed the initial executive order in December 2019
Absolutely.
that codified the definition of anti-Semitism as the IHRA definition and attempted to mandate that federal agencies utilize that definition, which criminalizes or uses state power to stifle a massive range of speech. And there are a million other examples of Trump and the Republicans being total frauds on free speech. So look, I mean, I get it. If you just want to call it a pure, cynical, pragmatic calculation, therefore nothing that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says ought to be taken seriously, then I'm willing to perhaps tentatively endorse that interpretation. But that really cuts against all this euphoria and these homages to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as this principled operator. He's a scam artist.
Well, I mean, I guess I can see that, right?
But I can see why RFK Jr. doesn't care about free speech related to Israel. I mean, him and Trump are definitely united in their fanaticism on Israel. So that might be something that might be something that they bonded over.
There's really no difference between Biden, Harris, Trump, and Kennedy, at least what I see on Israel, right? I think Harris has thrown a little bit of bones out in speeches, but I don't really see that as anything but words to try and satiate some people. So there's no difference on any of them in Israel, which is really unfortunate, honestly. Yeah. I mean, I think the euphoria is coming from the people who really are not value people, right? Like as I look, they're like the cat turds on X and stuff. Who they don't really care what the policy is. They want Trump to win, right? There was some populism behind MAGA before, and now it's like people who've just been on board, and no matter what, they want to win. But there are people who are making like real arguments as well too. Like I like this or I don't like this. Again, if Kennedy's only influence is going to be in, let's say, health and human services or something like that, which is kind of where I think, at least through illusions and what people have, talked about in the last 24 hours, then, I mean, that seems to be what he cares about the most. I don't think he cares that much about Israel because he's lockstep with Trump, right? So like whatever Trump does, he's going to be fine on. There's a lot of things he's not going to be fine on. For example, the free speech thing. I mean, I think Trump honestly doesn't really care because we know from the Twitter files that the Trump admin was also censoring Kennedy too, right? When they had those hearings and everything like that. So all of that was very true, but I don't think that was Trump directed. And I think Trump is pretty much for sale right now these days because his political life exists in winning this election. And so he's given, he's moved left on things like abortion. And I don't think he's really an ideologue on these things like free speech. And so if Kennedy wants to push free speech, Trump would be like, I'm the greatest free speech president ever. I did all these great things for you, but really it was Kennedy pushing it. Trump's kind of for sale on those things. He doesn't really, he's a businessman. He's not an ideologue. So I think Kennedy sees an avenue there. Whereas I think the Democrat Party and Harris, I think it's a different story.
Okay. So, but if RFK Jr. said 6 months ago, a year and a half ago that, look, if this doesn't work out, sure, I'll accept a minor bureaucratic role in the Department of Health and Human Services, I'm not sure he would have generated the interest in his campaign that was generated. So that's why I keep saying it's a ruse. I mean, if we could all acknowledge and agree that it was a ruse, I'm willing to accept that as an agreed upon premise, and we can sort of move on from there. But like, I mean, I acknowledge that RFK Jr. does appear to have sincere interest in issues like removing toxins from the food supply or whatever. I don't disagree with that. In theory, it seems like a perfectly worthwhile cause, but that's not something I've really ever heard Trump talk about. That just seems like a random pet issue of RFK Jr.'s that he's trying to now glom onto Trump to make it seem like this entire exercise of running a campaign was like in keeping with RFK Jr.'s underlying principle, which it just obviously and manifestly was not. And then also on Ukraine, RFK Jr. in his speech on Friday, which I sadly subjected myself to listening to, said that, one of the things that he supports Trump on or something like that was the approach to the war in Ukraine. Okay, give me one detail about how Trump will end the war in Ukraine. I've been asking for this for over a year and a half, longer. Trump just repeats this platitude that he will end the war in 24 hours. And in order to get even the most minor clue about how he would actually go about doing that, we've been forced to just look at what his advisors are saying and the people who are putting forth policy plans in his orbit, like the America First Policy Institute, which is more than likely going to be largely staffing the next administration. It was already announced a week or two ago that Linda McMahon, the head of the America First Policy Institute, is going to be running the Trump-Vance transition team. And if you look at their policy documents on Ukraine, it's about continuing to arm Ukraine, removing constraints that the Biden administration has at least partially placed on Ukraine for use of U.S. armaments to wage the war. They complain that Biden hadn't escalated the war aggressively enough. That's the policy thrust of those statements. So, I mean, can RFK Jr. enlighten us as to how Donald Trump is going to end the war in Ukraine, which is supposedly RFK's big issue? Instead, we get these ridiculous platitudes and these vapid statements that don't amount to anything tangible. So, okay.
Yeah. So I think the point I think I'm trying to make is that, so if you take a step back, like, I don't think any of these, not only do I not think that any of these things are genuinely said or positions are genuinely held, I don't even really know that they're in control of anything. And I know that seems like it would have been a conspiracy theory a lot, but like, for at least the past couple of years, the president has been non-existent and been run by someone else. Who's running it? I don't know, but whoever that is who's going to be running it, no matter who gets in. They're just saying, I mean, we have a guy that used to be a reality TV star in the WWE and with another guy that has brain parasites and runs around with a bear carcass in his car. And then the other lady she was Montel Williams' side piece that no one voted for and is somehow running. It's all nonsense. Like, looking for consistency is the problem. There's no consistency to be had. It's just it's a nonsense show.
So then how should anyone cover U.S. politics? Just ignore it and say it's all nonsense? I mean, that doesn't seem like it's particularly productive.
Well, I would say that, has any of it been productive? Has any of the punditry produced anything in the positive direction in the past 20, 30 years? I don't think so.
Know. That's a pretty broad question. I mean, I try to do what I can.
I mean, yeah. So I think that, but I think the thing to get people in a productive way is to look at, okay, the system, quote unquote, seems to be entrenched in something that none of us can really change. So we have to pull back from our reliance upon the system at all in hoping to fulfill our hopes and dreams in life. That would be my positive spin on politics. Like, if you want positive things to happen, you're right. You ain't going to be voting for it, in my opinion. I think no matter who gets in, we're going to continue the genocide in Gaza, my opinion. And the Ukraine war, it doesn't matter. And the rest of it is just fluff, and the machine's going to run is how it's going to run.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. I'm just sending a link to another person.
Yeah, no worries. I actually feel that is one thing that Trump will probably work to end. Now, will it happen in 24 hours? Absolutely not. Like, he's just a boisterous kind of showman.
I think will he work to end?
Say again?
What will he work to end?
The war in Ukraine.
How?
Yeah, he's not going to do that.
What will we do? It's August 25th. Why don't we know a single detail about what he's going to do?
Because he hasn't really been held to account. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
Including by RFK Jr., apparently, who claimed that this was one of his signature issues, and that's led him or compelled him to endorse Trump.
I mean, if you don't push Trump on, for example, abortion, like, he's not going to want to talk about abortion, right? Because that's just something that's going to instigate people to vote on the Democrat side. So as long as he doesn't have to, he's not going to give policy positions. And I mean, I see some of the logic there, but also it's not right? It should be pushed for actual details. When you do interviews, Kamala's not doing it, nor is Trump doing it in order to give like actual plans. They say, hey, I'm just going to do this. It's not going to cost anything, whatever. But I do think that it would be actually really easy and I have a military background, to end the war in Ukraine. You do what he just kind of did with the Zelensky thing. You say, hey, I'm just going to withhold aid, right? Like, there is no existence for Ukraine for very much longer if aid is withheld. I mean, that's just an unfortunate reality for them. So
what's the evidence that Trump plans on withholding, quote unquote, aid? Trump was integral in getting past the largest ever provision of U.S. so-called aid to Ukraine in April. He's the one who gave Republicans in the House cover to vote for the national security supplemental for $1 billion for Ukraine, which could subsidize the war for at least another year or so. And I have talked to plenty of Republican members of Congress who verified that. So, I mean, everything in the record suggests that Trump has no intention of doing that, other than people's wishful thinking. So if there's more to it than
but see, that's why they do it.
Days, why doesn't Michael, and RFK Jr. is now trying to encourage his supporters, at least in the 10 swing states, to vote for Trump, in part based on their supposed convergence on the issue of the Ukraine war. When are we going to get a specific? Are we just supposed to do the trust me bro thing?
Well, I think
which if you do, then you're one of the most gullible dupes in history.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, Trump did not accomplish half of what he really should have in his first administration. You can give excuses for why, and there are some decent excuses for why or why not, but he didn't do it. However, the inability to move equipment forward into Ukraine is just going to be, I think, an easy answer, because at the time the Ukraine aid was tied to the budget, and that was a huge deal. So that whole fiasco there of like that stonewalling in Congress was really looking bad on Republicans. And I feel like that's the reason why he led up there, because he was not looking to have something to drag him down in terms. And I think it's the same reason why the border bill he killed, because he wanted something to fight with. And then he saw that Ukraine was becoming an anchor on him because they were holding up the the Ukraine bill in Congress, and it was causing a stir. And so he's like, okay, I don't want anything to stop me from winning this election. So though, I mean, again, he's not ideological on these things. And I'm not even going to use the word pragmatic. He's just like a negotiator on these things. So I do think he has a belief once he gets in office, because he kind of said it very early on that he's going to end the war. He already did stop aid when he was on that phone call with Zelensky when he was trying to get dirt on Joe Biden. I think he
never actually stopped it, though. There was never a missed shipment of that aid, notwithstanding the hysteria around that first impeachment. So
yeah,
Trump reliably shipped out the aid that he authorized to Ukraine without interruption. I mean, you can say that, yeah, Trump has, quote, said he wants to end the war, but everybody says that. Zelensky says it. Putin says it. The Biden administration has said that in various forms. It means nothing if it's not attached to any specific policy prescriptions, which Trump, as you acknowledge, has steadfastly refused to do. And nobody, quote, holds him to account, including now his buddy, RFK Jr., who's just repeating the propaganda on Trump's behalf and getting people to vote Republican without a single assurance about what is allegedly one of RFK Jr.'s marquee issues.
Well, the difference the difference is on the Democrat side, they want to end the war with Ukraine either pre-2022 or pre-2014 borders, versus where I think Trump is going to be fine.
Well, where does Trump want to end it?
I mean, if he's talking about negotiating already right now, it'll be something that's similar right now. Again, this is just me making
that's just in your head, though.
Of that at all.
I mean, so do you think that Trump has an ideological care to get Ukraine back to 2014 or 2022 borders?
I don't know. I mean, I think there are some indications that the Biden administration is not too keen on the only outcome of the war being like the expulsion of Russia from Crimea. I haven't heard that as the statement of policy anywhere, nor that they're necessarily in principle opposed to the idea of there being some settlement along current territorial lines. I mean, they're purposely vague about it, just like Trump is purposely vague about it. So the Democrats and Trump are united in their purposeful vagueness about what outcome they would like to see. In the meantime, they're just I mean, one of the points that was made about why Trump supported that Ukraine funding bill in April and what approach he might take in the future is that they're going to threaten Russia with even more escalation to supposedly force Russia to capitulate or to force them into submission by removing any of the minor constraints that the Biden administration has maintained on Ukraine's ability to use U.S. armaments in Russia. What is Trump's position on the current U.S.-backed incursion or invasion of Russia? Did RFK bother to ask him? Why doesn't he share that with us? I mean, this is why this thing is a joke. Anyway, we have somebody else has joined us, Chris, who, sorry, I forgot to send you the link a little earlier, but what are your, you've heard a little bit of what we've been saying thus far. And
yeah, but I think I'll start with the Russia thing. I think the points you're making are correct. The only thing I could say for Trump would be he would be more willing and more likely to trade away NATO expansion. Not that Putin would trust that commitment, since he's had that commitment before and NATO continues to expand. But as part of a negotiated peace, I think Trump would give that away all day.
But has he said
on the
that,
basis based on what? I mean, Trump brags that he has strengthened NATO. He touts all the supportive statements that the NATO Secretary General has made of him. He says that he's the best thing that's ever happened to NATO by accelerating the compulsion of European NATO member states to spend more money on quote unquote defense. He expanded NATO twice. He expanded the installation of U.S. military hardware in Ukraine. He elevated Ukraine's status within NATO, which is why, the handful of times where he's appeared on like this all-in podcast with one of his top mega donors, or I think he said something also to this effect with Elon Musk on the X space, he conveniently ignores that his administration was in perfect simpatico with Biden in elevating Ukraine into a subsidiary NATO status. Mike Pompeo, on Trump's behalf, one of the few administration officials who didn't have a petty, petulant falling out with Trump, but was perfectly in sync with him as far as anyone can tell, went to Ukraine in 2020 and said the U.S. policy is that Ukraine will join NATO. When has that been repudiated?
Kennedy should make sure it gets out too.
Well, I mean, I haven't heard anything about that. And Mike Pompeo was at the Republican convention. Clearly, Trump said he was going to already said he was considering him for yet another top administration job. So, I mean, so if RFK Jr. is just relegating himself to the relative irrelevancy of accepting some job on an FDA panel or in the Department of Health and Human Services, then that's a total, I think, squandering of whatever electoral and political energies he might have been able to galvanize. Just and for what? So he could kiss Donald Trump's ass? All right, join the club.
I think we probably agree on most of the points. My biggest quibble would be on whether it started off as a ruse from the beginning, because I do think RFK entered a race versus Biden and Trump and exited a race of Kamala versus Trump, where his support was starting to go through the floor. And he couldn't have known Kamala was going to enter the race. Also, when he entered the race, he was originally trying to run as a Democrat in a Democrat primary that Biden effectively canceled by canceling the debates.
Wait, so we touched on this before, but let's just go through it in a little more detail. I'm not claiming to be RFK Jr.'s psychiatrist. I don't know what's going on inside his head, so I can't speak to what his intention was other than what he has said and done. And what he's said and done prior to Friday is in no way consistent with him just giving himself over to be a cog in the Republican machine.
It is in some way consistent.
He spent the past 10 months or longer denouncing. And
it's consistent up to the point of he has always said from the beginning that he would not be a spoiler and that he would drop out rather than be a spoiler.
Okay, but so you could drop out without therefore becoming a de facto Republican. And also, what does that even mean to be a spoiler? I mean, there could be. I mean, Ross Perot, was he just a spoiler, or did he actually have some impact on U.S. politics? And isn't every third party castigated as a spoiler?
Yeah, but I think Ross Perot at 19% is different than RFK at 4%.
And so, what was Ross Perot's
lasting legacy? For a second, because all of RFK Jr.'s woes are blamed on the DNC suppressing him or something. And I don't deny that the DNC and the Democratic aligned groups funded very well-endowed efforts to challenge through litigation his ballot access. But I, for the first time on yesterday, actually, went and actually read the court's ruling in New York from earlier this month on the challenge to RFK Jr.'s claimed residency in New York. RFK Jr. has been a full-time resident, more or less, of California since, I think, approximately 2014 or 2017, whenever he married Cheryl Hines. And then, so that's his residence. He doesn't even deny it. Then when he picked Nicole Shanahan as his vice presidential nominee, they're both from California, so that could then pose some constitutional problems in terms of the Electoral College. So therefore, he apparently decided that he was going to claim as his primary residency this house in New York that he never lived in, that he never paid rent on prior to May of this year, when the New York Post reported that the house was in foreclosure, after having previously claimed that his New York residence was his other house somewhere else in Westchester County that he hadn't even been at since 2017, and he just prior to that stayed as an occasional house guest for one of his family friends. And like, there's evidence that he was like scrambling to like ship like certain like like a hamper full of clothes or something to the house very recently. I mean, so it's like it's a joke. So that's more evidence that this really was effectively a ruse.
He's a liar.
You can't blame the DNC for the fact that he had this bizarre F up over his residency, which of course is going to be challenged. That's challenged for every political candidate, not just RNC, not just RFK, because he's this big bugaboo for the DNC. Yeah, is there extensive litigation against RFK Jr. by the Democratic Party? Absolutely. That happens for every third-party candidate. The Republicans do it all the time with the Libertarian Party and the Constitution Party and other minor parties. It's the most
agreed, but you also have to talk about canceling the Democrat primary in the first place. I mean, setting RFK aside, you could imagine an entirely different contest had there been any type of primary with debates that could have exposed how unfit Biden was earlier in the process, where then an actual voter could have selected Biden's alternative rather than having a candidate at the top of the Democrat ticket who has received 0 votes.
I think that you could probably say that multiple things can be true at once. And the reality is this. Yeah, I think that RFK probably, some of the stuff that he did probably is a ruse. But the reality is that he never actually had any legitimate shot because he was given no media time. The Democrats forced him to spend like 70% of the money that he was fundraising for court challenges just to be able to get on ballots once he was forced to get out of the Democrat primary because they weren't even going to do a legitimate primary. So, I mean, I think that two things can be true at once here. Yeah, he's probably full of shit on certain things, but he also isn't lying when it comes down to the fact that the Democrat Party screwed him.
And earlier you were talking about it shouldn't have surprised him that Biden would use the power of incumbency to cancel the primary. But I mean, Senior Bush had to take on a primary contest with Buchanan. It's not uncommon even in the second term.
When you say cancel the primary, what do you mean specifically? The primaries were not technically canceled. They did hold primaries. They were de facto or informally rigged.
Well, they canceled the debates, and they canceled the debates, and some states even canceled the votes. They said, you know what, the party's just going to pick, like Florida, I want to say.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's correct.
There were some primaries were canceled because RFK Jr. wasn't even contesting at that point. So there wasn't even
there were other Democrats. There were other Democrats on the ballot.
Yeah, there were. I'm not defending the 2024 Democratic primaries.
Okay.
I will note that Donald Trump didn't debate in 2024 either, and nobody seems to be claiming that means that the Republican nomination was
no, but people still voted for him.
Yeah, people voted for Joe Biden too. Again, it was
but not Kamala.
It was a pale impression of a primary. I'm not denying that, but RFK Jr. could have run. He could have run in the New Hampshire primary, which is the first primary which vaults contenders, including Eugene McCarthy when he was running against RFK Jr.'s father in 1968, or actually RFK Sr. had not entered the race at that point against Lyndon Johnson. But that's sort of what compelled LBJ to exit the race in March because it showed that he had a formidable contender. RFK Jr. chose on his own volition to not contest in the Democratic primary. That was his choice.
If the question is, did RFK run a good winning campaign? The answer is no. If the question is, was it a ruse from the start? I think that's where I differ from you, just in that he went in with the intention of it being a ruse. I don't think he went into the race thinking that he was going to end up with 5% in the polls and, kissing Trump's ring to get a DHS job.
Yeah, I'm not opining on his. I'm not opining on his intentionality. How could I know that? I'm not inside the guy's brain. I'm saying now, in retrospect, it was a ruse. So whatever he might have consciously thought when he launched the campaign, we now know with certainty that the whole thing was a ruse because this is the final conclusion. So what the stuff that he said as of a month. So how should I interpret RFK Jr. as of a month or two ago having these searing critiques of Trump, accusing Trump of colluding with Biden and corporate media to exclude him from the debates? It wasn't just the DNC that RFK Jr. was saying had excluded him from the debates. He was saying it was Trump in concert with Biden and CNN or other corporate media organs that were excluding him from the debates. And I read some quotes of a post that RFK Jr. did in May where he's saying that Trump is an unrepentant enabler of quote unquote neocons, and he bragged about arming Ukraine more than Obama did. Basically, that his first term was a disaster, and if you think that his second term would be any different, you're delusional. That was RFK's message as of May. So, what does a rational person look at that statement as of May, and look at what he's doing now, and conclude. I mean, I think ruse is actually a charitable way of putting it.
No, well, but I think ruse does connote some level of intention. Like,
yes,
to say somebody's doing a ruse means there's intent there.
He would have intention.
I think a month ago, he didn't know Biden was going to drop out and Kamala would be the candidate. That is such a shift.
I'll go with the sham.
Okay.
I still think there's intentionality up front. Honestly, he has to make decisions in space and time, right? And so here we are a month later with the situation has changed. And honestly, all those things that he believes about Trump are probably still true. Now, is he going to say them as fervently when asked now? I highly doubt it, right?
Well, and I think if you were turning what he would say into one sentence, he might say, Trump is still terrible and Kamala's worse.
Exactly. And this is a coalition for convenience at the time, right? Like, I don't think that he's a Republican now. He's MAGA all the way, and he's going to, use the verbs and color it his own way. I gave you the example of World War II, right? Like the KMT and Mao were fighting each other in a bloody civil war, but when Japan invaded, they teamed up to fight against Japan. And then when they won the war, they ended up going back to killing each other again, right? Like that's politics.
But he is now more full-throatedly declaring himself to be some sort of MAGA supporter. I read earlier in this stream this bizarre, I think insultingly stupid tweet that he put out earlier this morning on, quote, what MAGA really means. Like he's Ralph Waldo Emerson or something. And he's giving us like this spiritual take on what the true meaning of MAGA is. He says, Make America Great Again recalls a nation brimming with vitality, with a can-do spirit, with hope and belief in itself. It was an America that was beginning to confront its darker shadows, could acknowledge the injustice in its past and present, yet at the same time could celebrate its successes. It was a nation of broad prosperity, the world's most vibrant middle class and ideal belief in freedom, justice, and democracy. I mean, this is just a bunch of bullshit.
It's terrible.
It's amazing that anybody could look at that and be impressed. I know everybody.
And it's terrible. It is terrible to follow what I thought was a great line. I hope we'll decide to love our children more than we love hating each other, which was a fantastic line. And to follow that with this MAGA poetry is.
Yeah. So RFK Jr. is a MAGA Republican now, isn't he?
I have to say that soliloquy poem, whatever, is frightening.
Yeah. So I mean, Chris, so you tell me what word to use for the whole experience of RFK Jr. I was skeptical of it very much from the beginning. I got huge pushback on X and social media, similar to what I'm getting now, because people like want to believe in this mythologized conception of RFK Jr. as battling the deep state on behalf of his martyred uncle and father. I don't know when it became a credential to run for president that your father and uncle were killed, but okay.
The mythology is such a great word to use because going into it, he's trading on his name.
Exactly. He would be trading on non-entity if his name was not Kennedy.
And I guess, again, I think ruse is just too strong a word because it has some level of intention from the beginning. You could easily say it's a disappointing campaign.
I'll call it a swindle.
That's fair.
I think it's a swindle.
I'm willing to accept that term.
I think that's fair.
If you bought something from somebody they advertised, and then they said they fully intended to deliver it to you, but then later said, "Well, never mind. I'm not going to focus on delivering that to you anymore." Would you call that a scam?
It would be a scam.
It'd be a scam, right? Exactly. His intention may have been at the start, but then later he was like, "Well, but no." Which maybe
what he was promising is that Joe Biden wouldn't be president, and that is happening.
But that's not what he was promising. You're just making that up
promising for the past 10 months. Okay, so another good analogy is, let's say you pay a contractor to do some work on your house.
Yes.
They fully, quote, intended to complete the work. You gave them all the resources that they needed, money, help, whatever, and then they just don't complete the work. What do you call that?
Scam,
sham, ruse. I'm willing to entertain a whole variety of potential words that
people. Well, contracts generally have things like active God clauses or like unforeseen circumstances in them too. I mean, to be fair, right? Like there's normally unforeseen circumstances or active God clauses or things like that. And so
there was no act of God preventing him from continuing to run, though.
Yes, there was, because Biden
didn't come down and say, "You must
Biden
stop."
said it would take God coming down to tell him to get out, so God must have been involved.
And a thunderstorm that hits your tree that knocks out the contractor's truck that's going to work on your stuff. Like, I mean, you could say that's not an act of God either. It's just a term, but you understand what we're saying.
But nothing stopped RFK except his own choice.
Wait, but hold on.
His support dropping from double digits to single digits stopped him.
Yeah, and he had no money. Like, I think that like at the end of the day, he's got like $300,000 or something as of like June 30th. Like, the guy had no money left because
he ran out of money, which is a marker of a failed campaign.
He screwed up his residency. You could call it a failure. That'd be a good word for the campaign.
All right,
but this is no different than any other defeated candidate exiting a race.
Yeah, it is different. It is different. It's different than a Democratic primary or a Republican primary. So Ron DeSantis drops out of the race in the Republican Party and ultimately endorses Donald Trump. Or, I don't know, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders drops out of the 2020 Democratic primaries, ultimately endorses the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. They all say that they're going to do that from the outset. They say we're running to win the Democratic nomination, and if we lose, we're going to support the ultimate nominee of our party. They go into that saying it. So if you don't like it, you don't have to support them, but that's what they say they're going to do. RFK Jr. never said he was going to do anything to this effect. He said he was going to be running this groundbreaking, innovative, exciting, independent candidacy as of last October. So
but also,
if that's what you thought you were betting for, you got screwed.
He has also been saying he would not stay in as a spoiler.
I think the Bernie Sanders comparison is actually pretty good and pretty funny. Like, one of the first things I brought up was these people who wielded power at the time they had it or didn't have it, right? Bernie got completely screwed by the DNC, and he's lost all legitimacy, and he's just falling in line now. Like, there's no Bernie movement now. Like, we're not talking about Medicare for all. We're not talking about any of those things right now because Bernie spoiled his moment. And what I think RFK is doing, whether you like it or not, is RFK is jumping on what he has at the moment to get at least a little bit of something. I mean, you keep referring to it as like some bureaucratic departmental position in the HHS, but if he's the HHS secretary, he'll have a lot of power. Now, it's not presidential power, and we'll have to see how it plays out if they win, but it is a lot better than where Bernie is sitting, I would say.
Some power is better than no power.
Bernie always said that he would support in 2016 and 2020 the ultimate Democratic nominee.
Agreed.
RFK Jr. never gave an indication that, if I run out of money and I screw up my residency status in New York State, I'm therefore going to become a MAGA Republican. I mean,
but what about Bernie's ideas? Where's Medicare for all right now?
Well, I mean, Bernie says that Bernie was one of the few people who was still supporting Joe Biden as the entire party was turning on him because he was saying that Biden's given me a seat at the table. We've done some legislation that Bernie liked. So if you ask Bernie himself, he says that he's gotten a lot from his.
And I would be willing.
Joe Biden, and in fact, it was more straightforward or above board than what RFK Jr. is saying, because at least Bernie Sanders tried to contest the Democratic nomination, failed, supported the nominee. RFK Jr. is doing this bizarre thing where he was at least purporting to run this independent campaign to challenge the two-party system, and now it's just becoming a cog in one of the major corporate parties that he was previously maligning as of like 3 weeks ago.
I mean, Bernie was saying he was going to start a revolution and all this stuff too.
Yeah, within the Democratic Party.
He's just he's just a cog in that. I would be willing to bet, I don't have data on this, but I would be willing to bet that a lot of RFK supporters were Bernie bros and we're like twice bitten now and they're ready to move out.
All right, Eric Blair has joined us, so if you have a point to make, go ahead.
Thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Good. And always, I just want to congratulate, or I want to thank Michael for taking on all comers, because that's one of the best things about you. But anyways, I have two questions then for your thesis, which is, do you believe that you called it a scam? Do you believe it was RFK's intention from the very beginning to eventually endorse Trump? A. And then B, I guess kind of a wrinkle on that. What do you think of the fact that there were reports that he was trying to make the same deal with the Harris campaign, but they didn't really take his call?
Well, I mean, we've been over this question of intentionality. Again, I cannot get inside RFK Jr.'s brain, nor would I want to, because I might get brain worms. I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't tell you what his intention was at the beginning, because how could I opine on that without being inside his head, right? So all I know is based on his public statements, the impressions that he was giving to people, the basis on which he was collecting contributions and donations and supporters. And the idea that if you had asked, if you had been told a year ago or 6 months ago that the sum total or the end result of the RFK Jr. groundbreaking independent campaign and insurgent Democratic primary campaign would be that he would just become a cog in the MAGA machine and ask his Donald Trump, I mean, please. I mean, that would not have been consistent with the impression portrayed. So I don't know what his intention was. I can't say. All I can look at is the end result and then use that to, in retrospect, assess what RFK Jr. was doing this entire time. He raised millions of dollars to build up a 50-state vote infrastructure, which can then, he went around to different states and sought the nominations of independent parties, like as far-flung as the Alaska Independence Party and other random parties around the country, certain state chapters of the Libertarian Party and the Reform Party. So he screwed all them over.
Well, hold on.
Your point's a fair point, but I think that I don't think he was actively directing that. I think he hired ballot access consultants that took the path to least resistance.
He's the candidate. He hired him.
Yeah,
I understand.
Though, doesn't it make, wouldn't it be...
And Eric, just to clarify something, I'm not wedded to the term ruse. Chris and I had been discussing earlier. I'm open to a variety of different terms. Swindle maybe is a more apt one. We both agreed failure, joke, fiasco, something like that. All that works for me. Ruse, if it implies too much intentionality, I'm willing to opt for a different word.
Well, wouldn't it be enough to say that RFK gave it his best shot? He thought he had a chance of winning, or he thought he could have some influence running for president. Now, circumstances have changed, and he can see the writing on the wall, so he's trying to do the next best thing, which is to try to endorse whichever candidate he might think would give him some chance to have would win and give him a chance to have access. And that's why I asked about, well, he did actually also try to talk to the Harris campaign as well. So, it's unfortunate that he would have to do this, or that he's in this position, but isn't it enough to say that he tried, he failed, and now he's trying to do the next best thing?
Do you see a lot of coverage of what RFK Jr. is doing, especially on the euphoric, jubilated right-wing media or alternative media, casting his campaign as a failure? It seems like they're elated. It seems like that they're calling this like this ultimate triumph of independence and taking on the deep state, when what they're really cheering functionally is that RFK Jr. might have given a marginal benefit to Donald Trump in his odds for winning the election, which I get. If you're a hardcore Trump supporter or partisan, I get why that might be what you're choosing to focus on.
And if he had endorsed Kamala, they would not be cheering him, and the Kamala people would. So
I'm not surprised that Kamala did not entertain discussions with him. But
and I do think, back to your point earlier about Pompeo, I do think, to whatever claim the Trump movement has had on populism, if he brings people like Pompeo back in, that's more neocon than even the Democrats are trying to be at that point.
Yeah, RFK Jr., I've read this, I'll pull it up again because it's amazing. RFK Jr. in May, in that big critique that he put out of Trump, said that Donald Trump, the message effectively was, Trump has learned nothing about regarding who he staffed his administration with the first time. And he's now even talking about appointing Lindsey Graham Secretary of State. I didn't know that to be a legitimate rumor, but that's what RFK Jr. claimed. And he was citing that as evidence that people who think a second administration under Trump will be any different than the first are engaged in wishful thinking, so essentially delusional. So I would like to know, if we're all supposed to be so appreciative and respectful of this pragmatic decision, then how does any of this get reconciled? Nobody's even asking for it to get reconciled. The Ukraine stuff is even more galling and incredible. If he is going to be bringing in Mike Pompeo to run U.S. foreign policy, just like he did in the first administration, and that's supposed to, quote, end the Ukraine war, has it occurred to anybody that Donald Trump has provided virtually zero details about how he's going to end the Ukraine war? Because ending the Ukraine war is just a cliche that anybody can repeat. That's what the Ukrainians themselves even say. That's what Putin says. Nobody says, oh, we're in favor of the Ukraine war continuing. Nobody ever puts it that way.
Right. It's the Nixon.
Has it ever occurred to you that maybe he's concealing these details because his policy is actually not going to result in the cessation of the hostilities, but perhaps even an escalation of them, which is what many of the Republican hawks who he's looking inclined to empower again, that's what their agenda is. So, if RFK Jr. is giving legitimacy to Trump by saying anybody who agrees with me or thinks they agree with me, RFK, on the issue of the Ukraine war should therefore support Trump, then that's a scandal. I mean, that's another reason why I might be inclined to use the word ruse, because I think that comes close to what you might call some form of active deception.
Well, Kamala called Biden a racist, so.
Yeah, but that's true. I mean, I'm not defending Kamala, but if the idea is that RFK Jr. is just as cynical and opportunistic as Kamala Harris, okay, I'll accept that.
In fairness, unlike many endorsements, especially from losing candidates who are there to kiss the ring, I think both in his standalone press conference as well as his rally appearance, I think in both instances, he did say as part of his endorsement, we have many disagreements, which is more than you get from a lot of, to use your term, ass-kissing politicians who are just kissing up.
And what was his alternative? To endorse Harris, with whom he has even more disagreements. So it's the lesser of two evils to him. Well,
and I don't think anyone here is celebrating RFK being in the race or out of the race. I think I agree with 90% of what you were saying, other than I felt ruse implied that he was doing this illegitimately from the start. And I think this is where he found himself, 5% support, and trying to see if he could get any value of having spent the last few months running for president. Could he get any of his agenda on the map?
Well, you asked, like, what was his alternative? I mean, one of the potential alternatives, which he chose not to opt for, is that he could have actually ran the independent campaign that he was claiming he was going to run. He's already on ballots. He might not even be able to withdraw from some ballots, like in Wisconsin, because
But you said earlier that he would, like, you know, in the Democratic primary, for example, when someone drops out, they say hey, I'm always going to support the Democratic candidate. All right. And so, like, they're doing the thing that they've always said. He said that he was never going to be a spoiler from the start. So when he sees himself being a spoiler, like, why would he continue to run? Like, because that is a promise that he made from the very beginning. So again, he's holding up that one promise that he did make. You can't have it one way and then not the other way.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there's some ambiguity around what it means to be a spoiler. Does that just mean he loses the election, and therefore his ultimate, like, utility in the race was just to be a quote spoiler for one or the other candidates? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess that if that's what you mean by spoiler, I think that there's also, I mean, one of the arguments that was used for his campaign was that in setting up all this infrastructure for a viable national third-party candidate on a level not seen since Ross Perot in 1992, then there would be some, future infrastructure that would be in place to perhaps continue to challenge the third-party system. So I think spoiler, I mean, if now he's even validating this idea that third-party candidates, if they don't win, are just spoilers, then he's even further denigrating the very concept of a third-party candidate, because then they're always just quote spoilers. I mean, was Ralph Nader? I mean, so do we now agree that Ralph Nader was just a quote spoiler for George W. Bush? If so, then you just validate every Democratic grievance against Ralph Nader that they've been nursing for 24 years. I even just saw the Democratic convention this week that there's still like posters in the big auditorium that they had set up castigating Ralph Nader.
The path for third parties, though, I think has mainly been, maybe with rare exception, to get a single or maybe two agenda items absorbed into the larger party.
I think that's what we saw with the libertarians and Trump at the libertarian rally, but to go back on the infrastructure piece, right? Again, if Kamala wins, at least the logic, that people are saying that Kennedy's thinking, again, not being able to get in his head, that's 8 years. He's going to be 78, 79, the same age as what Trump. Like, there's no saying how much political power he's going to have then. And his numbers have fallen below 5%, so he's not going to get federal matching funds. So I think he saw that idea of this viable third-party option also slipping away from him too, right? So like, he just keep going lower and lower as, hey, I have a path to victory. I have zero path to victories, but I can set up a viable third party. Hey, it doesn't even look like I can do that now. What's the next thing that I can hold on to and consolidate?
Another reason why you might reasonably call the campaign a ruse is because it is true that from the very beginning, his campaign was largely funded or received much of its funding from Republican billionaires or Republican mega donors like Timothy Mellon, the heir of the Mellon family fortune, like a banking magnate, funneled like a massive amount of money into both RFK Jr. and Trump simultaneously. And you had other donors whose names escape me right now who did the same thing. So if they calculated in funding RFK Jr. that they could do it as like a proxy of helping Trump, right? By in the first instance, creating a nuisance within the Democratic Party for, at the time, Joe Biden in the primary, or kind of attracting disaffected, maybe Republican-leaning voters who would then ultimately be urged to vote for Trump, then that, first of all, their calculation worked, if that's what it was. So congratulations to those scheming donors. But if that is true, then that really was sort of a ruse.
But that would be true whether he dropped out or not, right? Because the ruse kind of didn't work because Kamala entered the race, and that support left Kennedy to return to Kamala.
And also, it requires you to get as much in their head as it would for Kennedy.
I don't understand how Kamala replacing Biden fundamentally changed any of
Kennedy
Jr.'s like substantive critiques of the Democratic Party or of the political system, right? It was just replacing one figurehead with another.
It changed his support. It to the extent that of the 15%, 10% was Democrats who thought Biden was unfit and couldn't support Biden on a ticket and were looking for somebody Democrat-ish. They took RFK. And then when somebody who was not Biden and is younger and is, to some, more fit for office than Biden, then that support went from RFK right back to the Democrat Party. And then the other thing in terms of his billionaire backers, I mean, the thing I would say is that you could say his campaign got increasingly less credible each day. And one of those days was when he selected the person he selected for vice president. At that point, I think anybody who was hoping that this was a serious candidacy knew that it was I don't know. You know what it made me start to wonder was what is the thing that brings the Jill Steins and the RFKs and the professor whose name I'm forgetting who's running, Cornel West, is there that much money in running for president in a 3% campaign? And who's publishing that book?
Well, I mean, if RFK Jr.'s objective was just to raise his national profile, obviously he could sell a lot of books. He already has sold a lot of books with his Fauci stuff or what have you, and to angle for some sort of personal political power or stature, like within, even if it's as relatively lackluster as within the Department of Health and Human Services or on some FDA panel, then I think his calculation worked. But the whole idea, the whole thing that elevated him to the point where he could leverage that kind of power was supposedly he was galvanizing some kind of mass movement. And yet, as you pointed out, I mean, he picked up a random Google heiress as his vice presidential pick. And so, and that was probably the low point of the campaign, frankly, because what has she done for all these months when she's been ostensibly the vice presidential nominee for a viable third party candidacy, other than like do a dopey podcast and also write checks?
Well, I think
so
that's a little bit more, kind of
more evidence that
a lot of money
you don't want to use the
campaign.
word ruse, maybe kind of a sham or a.
No, but I think it's fair to say, if he was just a guy interested in grifting money, couldn't he have done the same thing in 2020? I do think there's something to be said for the world that COVID created and the things that the government did in the wake of that probably pushed him to run in the election more so than prior to that.
Yeah, I don't think he's solely. I mean, I think it would be unfair to surmise that he's solely interested in making money. There are other ways as a Kennedy dynast that I'm sure he could have made money as a lawyer or whatnot, and he already had made a lot of money. I'm just saying, increasing his own political prominence, which inevitably also then leads to opportunities to make additional money. So it's not just like about a pure political grift. I mean, who would go through the arduousness of
The media
running a
gauntlet.
presidential campaign, in order to solely to make money? So I don't think that's it.
Well, didn't he
but like
get
personal empowerment, personal self-aggrandizement, putting out this, I think, false mythology around the Kennedy family, because that's also contributing to his self-aggrandizement. I mean, the fanciful notions that people continue to have about John F. Kennedy never cease to astound me. We don't have to get down that rabbit hole entirely.
Well, or
right
any
now.
of these dynasties. Like, hey, my dad did something, so you should elect me. It's the craziest argument.
My uncle and dad got shot. Vote for me.
I'm tired of Bushes. I'm tired of Clintons. I'm tired of Obamas. I'm tired of Trumps, honestly.
Oh, get ready for Barron. Get ready for Barron.
Yeah, I mean, the Trumps could easily have a dynasty if they wanted. And yeah, I mean, Barron could be our overlord in like 10 or 20 years. So,
but didn't
I would rather vote for Barron than Trump Jr. or Eric Trump, but okay.
Didn't he get a concession out of Trump, which is that about the JFK records?
Yeah, but that's a promise Trump made in 2016 as well.
Trump said the same thing. Trump invoked his presidential authority to continue to conceal certain of the outstanding JFK assassination records, even though it was congressionally mandated that they be released within 25 years. So I think, in the wake of that Oliver Stone JFK movie, which I think, unfortunately, has contributed to much of this ridiculous mythos, but nonetheless, it did prompt Congress to pass a law that required the government to release, like in good faith, I forget the exact language, release all the outstanding JFK assassination records within 25 years. And that 25, this was like in 1991 or 2, I think. And then Trump happened to be in office at that 25-year mark, and he just kept delaying the release of the records. So why didn't he do it then?
And as a give to Pompeo, I think it was Pompeo who was lobbying him to keep it secret. And I think there was recently some reporting that I want to say it's Judge Napolitano. Yeah, who was saying that he had called, or Trump had called him, because apparently he called him from time to time to advise on some things. And in this case, it was in January, and he was talking to him about some of the people he was going to pardon. And the judge said that he had a bone to pick with Trump because Trump didn't release the records. And Trump allegedly said, if you saw what they showed me, you wouldn't have released them either.
Yeah, that's kind of, hearsay. Maybe he said something like it.
So I guess I would say if that's true, there's nothing to say that he's going to release it over the next 4 years either.
Well, when one of your supposed concessions is that you're going to set up some sort of independent commission to maybe eventually decide to do something in a couple of years, to call that a concession is probably to overstate the significance. It seemed like it was more about Trump wanting there to be some independent investigation in his own recent assassination attempt, because it was about presidential assassinations and throw RFK and the Kennedy mythology obsessives a bone about releasing some of the ancient documents.
And to your point, I think it's an acknowledgement of how small RFK's bargaining chip is. I mean, Kamala won't take his call. Trump is maybe going to have him head up something on child health, maybe, like if Congress wants to do it, or I don't know. Seems pretty thin. It's a pretty small bargaining chip.
People forget RFK Jr. went to Trump Tower in, I think it was January of 2017, while Trump was president-elect. And they had some sort of meeting, and I forget how this was publicized or announced, but there was some indication that Trump was going to bring RFK Jr. in to run some sort of like vaccine inquiry or something to do with children's health or whatever. And then it just never happened. So if the concession apparently is Trump offering RFK Jr. the same thing that he offered him in January of 2017 before RFK Jr. ever ran his alleged presidential campaign, I mean, that's a hilarious concession.
Well, and especially like you're saying, a previously broken promise, both on the JFK files and on the and on the healthcare front.
Yeah. What else? I mean, there's other stuff. I mean, people keep accusing me of being overly emotional or like personally slighted or aggrieved about this. I'm not. I mean, I do find the mythology around the Kennedy family annoying and how it's misappropriated and used to. I mean, here's what does genuinely bother me about it. Okay, and this was one of my criticisms of the RFK Jr. quote unquote campaign from the very beginning, which is that he's like putting out a phony critique of the deep state, therefore kind of tricking people or misleading people into buying into his version of a quote deep state critique, and therefore squandering whatever genuine concern there is out there for scrutiny and oversight and transparency related to the intelligence services or the federal law enforcement agencies or U.S. foreign policy. So by making it out to be this like martyr myth that, of course, involves his own family, and then you're sort of misdirecting whatever legitimate energy might be directed toward doing legitimate oversight. And now he just has, completed that little facade by saying, "Oh yeah, now the big champion of the deep state of countering the deep state rather is him in concert with Donald Trump." What? I mean, what indication is there that Donald Trump wants to disempower or impose oversight on the intelligence services or the federal law enforcement agencies or on the military-industrial sector? Just go look at what RFK Jr. himself said about Donald Trump as of a month ago. He said that he would do the exact opposite. So now you're kind of undercutting or misdirecting or disempowering whatever semblance of actual momentum or energy might have been built up around this movement to curb some of the excesses of the deep state. Trump, to whatever degree that he actually does want to curtail the deep state, and I don't even use that term anymore because it's been so misapplied. I just say, permanent bureaucracy, national security state, whatever. Trump just wants it to be more like politically responsive to him and his appointees to preserve, to fulfill their fundamental task of advancing and preserving and expanding American hegemony. I mean, Trump endorsed renewal of FISA warrantless surveillance in April on the grounds that he and Mike Johnson decided that he wants to be the one presiding over the warrantless surveillance. So it's just about Trump being at the head of this quote-unquote deep state architecture more than any kind of principled criticism of the deep state itself. And RFK Jr. is now giving license to Trump, giving whatever credibility people might have perceived him to have in terms of counteracting the deep state, and just handing it over to Trump, which seems like it's been that's like a total abdication of
to your point. I think Trump gets an abundance of credit for doing something that the Harris campaign has been doing, which is the vibes. Meaning that if you look at Trump's actions, policies, and appointees, it's entirely supportive of the military-industrial complex. Now, is he willing to stand on a stage with Putin and say, "I believe Putin more than I believe the CIA about what's happening in the world"? Yes. So does the deep state like that? No, but still, his power structure is still supportive. But
not even about what's happening in the world. Trump said that about what was happening with what had happened with respect to his own campaign.
Yeah,
meaning he was trying to downplay "quote unquote" Russian interference in the 2016 election, and so that he had talked to Putin, and Putin said that they didn't interfere. So that just related to Trump's own self-interest and his political standing, right? It wasn't even about what was going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, but what I'm saying is that because he used that rhetoric and was willing to say things against his own intelligence community, people overassign him credit that somehow he's fighting the deep state or fighting the military-industrial complex, when really the only thing that you could credit him for was not starting more wars while he was in office. But short of that, as soon as you have Pompeo, I mean, that's as military-industrial complex as you need to get.
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
and as RFK pointed out, I mean, Trump escalated every war that he inherited.
But I would also say, other than RFK supporting AIPAC or Israel, are there other military-industrial complex? Isn't it possible that RFK is still anti-military industrial complex? He just happens to support Israel.
Well, I mean, Israel, I don't think is really just a side issue that can be brushed aside. I mean, we're on the verge of like constant cataclysm in the Middle East related to Israel, and RFK was more fanatical, perhaps even than Trump and Biden, on the issue of Israel. I mean, there's an irony in like running this supposedly audacious third-party candidacy separate from the constraints of the two-party system and being the most fanatical on Israel, which was just bizarre. And I mean, so that's like one of the core planks of the military industrial complex. I don't think it's just like a side issue. And I also do think that the superficiality and the hollowness of RFK Jr.'s critique, such as it existed, detracts from having any fulsome larger critique of the military industrial complex, as evidenced by him being willing to just relinquish whatever standing he had on the issue by saying, oh, yeah, we're just going to all now rally around Trump if you're against the deep state. That tells me that RFK Jr. really did not have much of a coherent or substantive critique of the deep state if he's willing to just abandon everything he had been saying up until this past Friday so that maybe he can get a spot on the Department of Health and Human Services, like children advisory panel. I mean, okay.
I mean, I don't think he's gunning for like, children advisory panel or something. I think he's gunning for the secretary. The secretary of HHS.
Secretary of Health and Human Services? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see.
So, I mean, that's a pretty powerful thing. And I mean, in his speech, Kennedy was talking about, the revolving door between Big Pharma and HHS and things like that. So, I mean, we can talk about the deep state, but there is that cronyism, deep state. I'll use the term, but I think you know what I mean. Within that sector of government as well too, which is what Kennedy ostensibly is going to try and go after, So Trump may have some desire to go after the deep state. His biggest failure has always been, the whole like people are policy type of thing, like who you put in these jobs, Pompeo, that's what you're going to get. And I think he really didn't have enough people that he knew in DC to go in the first term. I think he knows a little bit more people now, but he still is keeping these other orbiters around, like Mike Pompeo and all these others. You can see in the convention, right? Like Haley was around and she's getting in line. He's like, yeah, we may have a spot for all that stuff.
Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, who's almost picked as VP.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not like this absolute apologist for Trump, right? Like,
but it is a form of apologia for Trump to say, oh, one of the biggest problems was always about who Trump chooses to surround himself with. That kind of displaces responsibility from Trump himself. So the issue is never Trump himself. It's always these interlopers. It's always these unfortunate people who he surrounds himself with. It's always a way to deflect blame on these like secondary.
No, I'm very like plainly saying like he chose the wrong people. Now again, like it's not really.
Couldn't he also be the wrong person then if he's constantly every single time, quote unquote, choosing the wrong person? That's the online right wingers are always outraged by everybody who's in his inner circle. I mean, including now the chief strategist Susie Wiles, Chris LaCivita, the campaign manager.
So if you're conservative,
so is he picking the wrong people, or could he be the wrong person?
Both. Right. So
okay, there you go.
Trump blew the doors open in 2016, right? Because he's the only one that started talking about these things. Everything else was neoconservatism, right? Like, get a little bit into it. A lot of these never Trumpers that left the Republican Party and joined the Democrat Party are actually neoconservatives. There still obviously are a bunch around. You got like a bunch of people in the middle, huh?
Like who are these neoconservatives who have joined the Democratic Party? I know there's Bill Kristol.
I was going to say Bill Kristol, Michael McFaul.
He's a pundit. Michael McFaul
Bill Kristol has a lot more power, or at least had a lot more power in neoconservative circles.
That's one example. But like, why isn't Marco Rubio a neoconservative? He would have been 10 years ago. How about Tom Cotton? How about Mike Pompeo?
They're neoconservatives too. But I'm saying
it's idea that Trump has expunged the GOP of neoconservatives.
I mean,
never actually cites a concrete example other than Bill Kristol, who did work for Dan Quayle in like the early 90s and then ran the Weekly Standard, a magazine, and is now a media pundit. But in terms of the people who actually wield power,
wouldn't you say Kinzinger
they're all still in there.
was a
And
neocon?
And Nikki Haley was in Trump's administration and maybe back. I mean, they're all they just have rebranded as America First.
Okay, I didn't say that every neoconservative left the party. It's very clear by the names that you said, but a lot of them were that left the party and moved over. I mean, you just have all these like foreign policy people who thrive on wars and all the debt financing that war brings and all these things, the military industrial complex. There are a lot of those never Trumpers, right? There still are never Trumpers, or excuse me, neoconservatives in the party, but they either were a never Trumper and went back, or they weren't necessarily never Trumper, but they were neoconservative, right? So I think the way I would see this going is Kennedy thinks, well, if people is Trump's biggest problem, if I'm one of the people in there, maybe I can, get some influence and put my people in there. I think Kennedy today said, hey, we're looking at some Democrats to have in the campaign. You'll have to see who goes from campaign to, the transition team and things like that. Because Tulsi Gabbard is not really better on some of these issues as well. She's better, she was better on Syria, but other things like Syria, not that much better. But we'll have to see. I think Jim Mattis actually went in with that same thing, right? Like, hey, I have this patriotic duty, and I think he said at the time, when the president calls, you answer, right? And then he saw that, hey, I'm not really lining up with President Trump very much. Now, I still think Mattis is a neocon kind of guy, but I think Kennedy's going to find himself, within a year or two in some sort of, if they win, predicament like that. Like, I actually am kind of diametrically opposed. Now, maybe he'll be able to stick it out, and he's got his little corner, his little kingdom of an HHS or something like that. But to me, that's the logic of what Kennedy is doing, whether it's right or wrong.
Speaking of Tulsi Gabbard, she had given an interview around the time that I don't think she confirmed or denied whether she turned down the VP spot for RFK, but it seemed clear that she might have been offered it and declined. But she had said that her perspective was RFK's strategy was around getting into the debates, and she felt like there was not a great chance he was ever going to be in a debate. And so therefore he would never have a chance to really accelerate his campaign. And that's why she declined.
I guess she was right.
Well, maybe if he had picked Aaron Rodgers, who supposedly was also in the running, that might have been a publicity boost.
Well, so that's what I wanted to ask you.
My point is that, yeah, go ahead.
What was the low point? Because earlier I think we all agreed his VP pick was a very low point in the campaign. Do you feel like the rushing to support Israel was a lower point?
I personally do.
For me, the low point was in that first 6 or so months when he had announced, when he was going on all these stupid podcasts and he was just getting his ass kissed by every so-called alt media person. I mean, I was being constantly told that I had to appreciate his voice and the issues that he was raising, and nobody ever asked him really a critical question on these things.
I thought Dave Smith tore into him.
Yeah, later did on Israel. Earlier on, Dave Smith was a huge booster of him. But it was always about, Mr. Kennedy, please enlighten us and educate us about your amazing family legacy and what you're going to do to combat the deep state and repeat for the millionth time your theory on the Kennedy assassination or assassinations. And I just found it to be so tiresome and tedious. And it was also dishonest to me in a way, because clearly a central reason why he was getting a lot of this support or attention in that earlier phase of this campaign when he was nominally running as a Democrat was because it was kind of like a proxy thing for the Republicans, in that obviously if you want to defeat Joe Biden, who was then assumed to be the nominee, then to have a primary candidate who you can elevate will just be a thorn in Biden's side, maybe undermine him, maybe give him some something of a nuisance, and then ultimately weaken him enough where they thought that maybe that would enable Trump or whoever the Republican nominee.
You got to remember the environment.
So I always felt like a lot of the boosterism and the sort of uncritical, mindless promotion of RFK Jr. was, to me, very tedious and annoying and kind of not fully forthright. Because if you notice, once he declared himself to be an independent, and even eventually started attacking Trump here and there, including eventually somewhat vehemently, the Trump and the Republican and the Republican media apparatus were denouncing him as a radical leftist.
Yeah.
So clearly they never cared about his supposed issues. It was all about what function he could serve to help elect Donald Trump, right? So that was always their
yeah. I mean, there's like there was actually the very clear time frame when they thought that Kennedy was pulling from more Democrats, and he was on Hannity, and then like the news started coming out that's like, hey, it looks like he's pulling more from Trump. Then like the Hannity interview like was totally different. I always thought that was kind of funny. But to me, the way I remember the environment at the time is people were very sick of Trump. Like, hey, he has no future after January 6th. All this is going on. And then they were looking for alternatives like Kennedy, even though I don't think people quite understood at the time. Like, Kennedy is not a Republican and will never be a Republican. But people were just really sick of Trump. And so that was a potential option for people. But then those indictments just absolutely changed everything, right? Even the other Republican candidates, just in my opinion, they really never had a shot after those indictments. And I mean, I guess it's to be seen whether or not that play from the Democrats, I do consider it like political lawfare, is going to pay off for them or not, because people are saying that, Trump is the only person who can't beat Kamala. The others would have won, but I also have a hard time believing that because that's kind of wish casting too. People who couldn't win the Republican primary are supposed to beat the Democrat candidate. Maybe, who knows? But that's the environment as I remember it at the time and why it was kind of tedious around Kennedy.
Yeah, I don't think that, I mean, it's impossible to say with any certainty, but I said right after the 2022 midterms, when Trump announced officially his current campaign, that Trump was coming into the Republican Party, Republican primaries, I think almost unbeatable for whatever hype was being pushed around DeSantis by some of the conservative intelligentsia. I think to have a quasi-incumbent who has such an outsized personal attachment with the Republican primary base as Donald Trump, it's almost, to me, it was not ever particularly feasible that he was not going to be the Republican nominee if he chose to run. I think if he loses this year and chooses to run again in 2028, he's going to be the instant favorite, however old he might be. People's longevity seems to be increasing.
I think he'll be in jail if he doesn't win. I honestly think
maybe so. But
would you rather have him win now or have to watch him run again 4 years?
I'm washing my hands of all this. So
I really don't even think his heart is in it right now. I mean, he's golfing all the time. I think he's just having people do things for him. They're running the things again. Like, that's the most dangerous thing about it. You have Chris LaCivita, the people you mentioned before, Susie Wiles, all these people. I think that he is very willing to let other people come in and run these aspects for him. I think he is literally just fighting for his political and also personal freedom right now, his political life and his personal freedom to get out of jail as being the president. I really don't think he cares about too many things, to be completely honest. He's never been ideological, really. So that's why I think you're seeing him, as soon as polls start to hurt him, hey, I'm shifting a little bit left on abortion. Oh, I'm going to bring in Kennedy. Like, he's selling his soul right now.
Yeah. All right. Chris, I do see a comment for someone asking if you're single. So if you're looking for a hot date, I can hook you up.
I'll have to go through the comments.
yeah, exactly. And Ted, thank you for anonymously joining us, whoever the hell you are. I don't think you're the Unabomber. He's now dearly departed, RIP. So you're somebody else, but whoever you are, thanks for.
I can send you a letter if you want.
No, thanks. Actually, the Unabomber sent one of his letters was sent to not my hometown in New Jersey, but like the adjacent town, and that was one of the people that were killed in one of those attacks. But that's a side issue completely.
Right now, it's not funny.
And I have read his manifesto, like all good people on the internet. And yeah, thanks for joining me on this sort of impromptu. I guess this wasn't really a debate. Whatever I advertise as a debate never really ends up being a debate because I guess I'm too even keeled and good natured. More like an informed discussion.
Well, and I think we moved off of ruse to fiasco or something.
Yeah,
else.
That's fine with me. That's my big concession. I'm willing to accept that. All right, guys.
I appreciate all the content, Mike.
I really appreciate your time and bringing on the smaller accounts and people to talk. I do very much appreciate it.
Oh, and I should be on the show Breaking Points this coming week to talk RFK.
So, hey, they said that they were looking for you at the convention. They thought they spotted you a couple times, but I thought it was nice that they name checked you.
Oh, did they name check me?
Yeah, in their convention coverage, they said, "Hey, I think we saw Mike Tracy the other day."
Okay, yeah, I actually did. We're posting it today. Actually, we did a discussion with myself, Sagar, and Ryan Grimm on DNC stuff. So I'll post that probably almost right now.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you.
See you later, everybody.